Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz Interview Series with jazz pianist, composer, and educator Angelica Sanchez. We caught up with her about her new 2023 CD, Nighttime Creatures, with her Nonet. It was the culmination of 6 years of writing, rewriting, rehearsals, concerts, van trips with the band, and the love and support of friends and family. So she moved to New York from Arizona in '94, and since moving to the East Coast, she has collaborated with the best in the business and is now passing that on as a jazz educator to the next generation. Enjoy this interview.
Excellent. Angelica, thank you for taking a minute out for the show. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So before we get into your latest work, I want to kind of cover what we've lived through for the last 3.5 years getting through the pandemic. How did you get through it, and how did it change you?
I was very fortunate to be, during the pandemic, I was teaching at 2 different schools, and both of those schools had online classes, so I was able to maintain some income during that time. All of the concerts and tours I had scheduled for that time were canceled like everyone else's. So I had some teaching work to fall upon. It was still difficult because I wasn't full-time at those places, right? So they were supplementing my the music, money I was making from music. So I was fortunate to be home and teaching a little bit. And I still was playing gigs throughout the pandemic, probably in hindsight not the best thing to do. But I can remember playing at Smalls before there was a vaccination, and realizing, oh, this is probably not a good idea. But we have to work, right? We have to make music. So hold on one second. I'm sorry, my neighbor's using something outside. Let me move to a different part of the house. Sorry, do you need me to start that over?
No, you're good. No, I can edit that.
Oh, okay, cool. So, I was at home, and I had an opportunity to practice a lot and write music, and I played several concerts for no audience during that time. I was still doing a little bit of traveling, which was a little bit scary, but that's what we do, right? So I was still maintaining concerts through that time. Not as many as I had hoped, but it was nice to have the teaching online. I don't think students enjoyed online teaching very much, but I most certainly did. So.
Yeah, for sure. So how did it feel to be able to release a new album with your Nonet, Nighttime Creatures? What was that how did it feel to release that album, and what were the artistic forces that went into this?
Sure. Well, I had tried to record that record several times. I made a live recording of that group before the pandemic, and I wasn't satisfied with it, so I didn't use it. And so then the pandemic hit, and then towards the end of the pandemic, we tried to record again, but it just wasn't possible. Like, too many people had COVID, and we had worked previous to that, before the pandemic, for 4 or 5 years, touring, doing gigs whenever I could. So when we finally got to the studio, at the very end of the pandemic, at least what I consider to be the end, it was really amazing to have 2 days in the studio and do it the way I wanted. So it was a long time coming for me. It took a long time to put this recording out due to the pandemic and financial reasons, or I had to get funding for it, which I did. So a lot of things went into it. The musical part of making that record was a joy, and I think because I had so much time to hear the music in performance, I was really able to sculpt it and shape it how I wanted. Like, I made minor changes along the way, not big changes, but minor changes. So by the time we got to the studio, the band really understood the music. They were inside of the music. I had to say very little to the band in the studio, right? We went in and recorded it, and it was great. So I was very happy when it finally came out. It felt like it took a minute for it to come out.
So what are you ultimately hoping the listener gets from this album?
Well, I think that's up to the listener. The only thing I will sort of guide them to is to, just sit for, I think it's almost 80 minutes long. Sit for as long as you can without judging it. Just let the music roll over you, right? And see where it takes you. Everyone's experience is going to be different. I can't tell you if the music is good or bad. I can only tell you that it's honest music, and it came from a place of real love with the band and the music, and not all the music. Two of the tunes aren't mine, and those tunes are tunes that I really love, and I that's why I felt so strongly to include them. But just to sit and see where it takes you and to not judge it. It's very hard as humans for us to not judge things, right? We're all very good at doing that. And I always tell students and friends, I'm like, just sit in a chair and see what it feels like at the end of your experience, right? So that's all I hope for.
Right on. So talk to me a little bit about where you were born and raised and how these seeds of jazz grew into who you are today.
Sure. I was born in Phoenix, Arizona. I grew up in a Mexican-American family, and it was pretty isolating, musically speaking, as a kid. But the one thing that really changed things for me was my father had a wonderful record collection. He would get records from a friend of his who worked at a liquor company, because back then jazz labels used to send records to liquor companies to hand out as promos. So he had a pretty nice record selection, and in the collection was the Modern Jazz Quartet, Dave Brubeck, George Shearing. He had all the Gets a Go-Go records, Stan Getz. He had all the Brazilian Jobim records. He also had like Willie Bobo and Mongo Santa Maria. He had all of these records, Tito Puente, Xavier Kilgore. And at the time, when I was a kid, I just thought, oh, that's Dad's old-timey music, And one time around the age of 10, a local trio, I think it was local, I don't remember, a local jazz trio came to my grade school and played live in the cafeteria. And in hindsight, I was like, man, it must have been the worst gig for these guys showing up in this cafeteria with a bunch of screaming 10-year-olds. All the kids were going bananas, and I just became very fixated on what they were doing, and it was it felt like almost a movie. Like I became hyper-focused, and I really focused in on what they were. I was mesmerized. And I remember going home and asking my dad, do you have jazz records in your collection? He goes, yeah. And I said, can I listen to them? He goes, sure, have at it. So I just devoured his record collection. And then one day he gave me this record. He goes, this record's too wild for me. Maybe you like it. And it was Miles Smiles. And I remember putting it on and not even realizing you could make sounds like that. I couldn't understand what Herbie Hancock was doing. So I spent, all my teen years trying to figure that out and buying every Herbie Hancock record. And that I started backwards. I started being mesmerized by, George Shearing and Herbie Hancock, and then Herbie Hancock led me to Monk and led me to everyone else, right? So that's how it started, and it's still going.
Yeah, for sure. So talk to me about the move to New York. What was that like for you to, migrate to the land, the mecca of jazz, and to get there and to learn and play and grow? What was that transition like?
I moved, I guess I was about 20 years old when I moved to New York. And at the time I wasn't married, I had a boyfriend who's also a musician. And we drove across the country in like a U-Haul van, which we really didn't need to do. We drove into the village. We had an apartment reserved in the village that was a friend of ours' apartment. It was actually Richie Perry's old place, if you know Richie Perry, the saxophone player. And we brought all our things in the U-Haul van, and none of them fit in the apartment, so most of them ended up on the street corner. But I remember it was surreal for me. I worked at Tower Records. We had this apartment on the East Village on 6th Street, and it was sort of a magical time, and I was so broke. We were so broke back then, but it didn't matter. We still got to hear music, and we played a lot. And I started developing, relationships with musicians that I wanted to play with, and everyone was very open and kind, and that's what began. I think I moved here in 1995, and at the time I didn't teach. I didn't even have a degree or anything. I was just playing gigs. So that's how it started. And then, you develop relationships with people, and I still have relationships with all those musicians that I met at the beginning.
So obviously when you go to a place like New York as a jazz musician, you're bespeckled by all of these stages and venues. What was the one stage or one place or venue that you played at that you dreamed of and almost had to pinch yourself? You couldn't believe it was happening.
It wasn't so much the venues for me where I'm pinching myself, but it was with people that I was like, oh, wow, I can't believe I get to play, with Tom Rainey. I was very young at the time, or play with Michael Foreman acting, or or talk to someone like Fred Hirsch, or meet Kenny Werner. The summer before I arrived to New York, I went to a music camp in Sandpoint, Idaho, that Eddie Schuler was running, and the faculty was Joe Lovano, Kenny Werner, Billy Hart, right? So I got to meet these giants of jazz then, and I still maintain a friendship with all of them now, So I was very welcome when I got to New York, and I played a lot at the Stone back when it was in the Lower East Side. There were a bunch of clubs in the Lower East Side that I played with, and the Knitting Factory was still a place that was open to people that were unknown. No one knew who I was, but they would give you a little budget, and you play in the side room and the small room. So there were places to play. It's different now. There's less places to play unless you're a superstar, right? But it was mostly with people. When I get to play with people like Billy Hart or Dada Leo Smith, those are pinching moments where it's like, wow, I can't believe I get to play with this master of music, right? So, but places, not so much. Places come and go,
Yeah, absolutely. So you're pretty diversified as a composer and a performer, pianist, and educator. But what do you look forward to the most? What has been the greatest joy of being a professional musician for you?
I mean, making music is a gift to be able to do it. The greatest joy for me is just connecting with individuals and living on that higher plane of existence where music takes us. Every time I get to do it, it's thrilling. I just can't wait to do it again. I always joke with people after we play a gig, what are we supposed to do now until the next gig? Because life seems so boring when you're not playing. So it's that connection with people. We don't make art in a vacuum, so it's the connection, right, that you have with people. First, you learn it to connect to yourself and your instrument, and then you expand that to do it with other people. When you have these musical marriages with people, that's always thrilling, very exciting, right? You don't know what's going to happen, and you can't wait for it to happen. So that's what I look forward to.
The one thing, too, as you had mentioned, all these players and legends and luminaries like Dada Leo Smith, Paul Motian, Richard Davis, and there's all these people that you played with. And what do you get from the legends and luminaries that you like to pass on to your students, to those that you teach?
Oh, I've learned so many different things from all those folks that you mentioned. I think the biggest thing it sounds so simple when I say it out loud, but the biggest thing I've learned from people like Paul Motian or Dada or Richard Davis is that those folks were never in a rush to get anywhere musically. They were in the moment and didn't have an urgency to get anywhere or do anything, and let the music do what it's going to do. There's nothing you can control. It's not your music to begin with. It exists outside of you. You hope to just push your thoughts aside to let it pass through you, right? So, but this sense of space and breath I'm amazed when I'm still learning about it, but those are the things I took away from playing with those masters. It's like there was never an urgency they had nothing to prove to anybody. And that's what I tell students today. I'm like, you have nothing to prove to anyone except yourself. So, when you're trying to teach a student to be in the moment and also learn their instrument and develop their ear, when you tell them you're right where you need to be, just breathe into that space. You don't have to prove anything. So that was what I learned from playing with elders. That's one of the things. There's so many things, but that's a big takeaway.
So why do you love this thing that we call jazz?
Well, this thing that we call jazz is such a vast thing. I feel like the word jazzy isn't even a good word for it. I don't believe it can be described, right? But I love the music. I love it. I learned it as a Black American art form because that's where it came from. But we don't know where it's going. It continues to expand just like any language. Language evolves. There's an evolution to it, and the music is welcoming to everyone, right? But to deny the origins of it is criminal. So I always tell people, no, this is definitely a Black American art form. You have to recognize where it comes from and pay homage to those contributions. But I love that it music in general transcends all these worldly things right? That trouble us and the human condition and all that. So it has a healing effect to it. It sounds maybe a little trite to say it so simply, but it really does. Like when you play music, you're different after you play it, right? Your molecules change. We know that for a fact. Science does know that. So that's why I love it, and the connection to other people.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players and minds in New York City, Arizona, Kansas City, and spots all over the globe, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Angelica for coming on the show, for all the stories and time. If you want to hear more Neon Jazz interviews, you can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to us at YouTube, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to theneonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.